Okay, well, good morning, everyone. I'm Rob Atkinson, I'm president of ITIF. I want to welcome you to a really interesting and lively event this morning on internet politics and how do we make sense of all of these debates. So I'm going to just briefly review a new paper that we're releasing this morning, and then we'll have three great respondents to talk about their own views and thoughts on the issue, and then we'll have should have plenty of time for discussion and comments. We'll adjourn precisely at 11, if not before. So I will start by introducing our three panelists, and in order of their sitting here to my immediate left. We'll start with Morgan Reed, who is Executive Director of the Association for Competitive Technology, where Morgan specializes in issues including patents and copyrights. He's pretty much ubiquitous. He's advised the Senate High-Tech Working Group, the Congressional Caucus on IP and Piracy, the State Senate of California. He's been on TV, CNN, CNBC, a number of other different venues, and lectures all throughout the world, and has a background from living in China for a number of years. Next to Morgan is Adam Thayer. Adam is the past president of the Progress and Freedom Foundation. And there, when he was there, he analyzed public policy developments and their impact on technology. Prior to joining PFF in 2005, Adam was director of telecom studies at the Cato Institute and a fellow in economic policy at the Heritage Foundation. His work has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, New York Times, Forbes, Newsweek, Economist, and many, many others. He also writes regularly for the Tech Liberation Front blog. And as a preview announcement, we were so envious of Tech Liberation as such a good blog, we decided to start our own. So we have the really catchy term of the Innovation Policy Blog. And we had an internal contest as to when the thumb drive becomes a good name, and that's what won. So
Need better prizes.
Exactly. Our total lack of imagination. But that blog actually will be going live in a couple of weeks. It should be interesting. But Adam also has, he's been a member of the Harvard Law School's Internet Safety Technical Task Force, and an advisor to the American Legislative Exchange Council Telecom and IT Task Force, and also served on the NTIA Online Safety and Technology Working Group, still serves. And last but not least is Juliana Gruenwald, who is the editor of Tech Daily Dose at Congress Daily, and she covers a wide range of issues, including technology and telecom. Has covered this for more than a decade. We were just commenting on when we knew each other back in Interactive Week Day. I don't know if anybody remembers Interactive Week, but it was one of those sort of like Red Herring, one of those publications that existed during the boom and did really interesting work, but then once the boom ended, it ended. So, but Juliana has a long background in tech and understands these issues quite well. So let me start by talking about, in a lot of ways, I remember when I started getting involved in these issues, maybe even 10 years ago, in many ways, a lot of these issues in the internet policy space were somewhat technocratic. They didn't seem to evoke demonstrations in Mountain View in front of major technology firms. There wasn't a lot of heat. There was a lot more light, if you will. And obviously something's changed. These debates have become much more animated and oftentimes harder to resolve just because there are more groups pressing their own positions. And what we tried to do in this piece was to look and try to make sense of that. Who are the players in these policy debates, and how do they think, and what do they want? And so we did really two things. We identified 8 major groups, if you will, and then categorized those 8 groups on these 2 different factors, these 2 axes, if you will. So let me just quickly go through what we think are the major 8 groups in this policy space. Start with cyber libertarians. These are the folks who, if you were ever on the well, you're probably a cyber libertarian. They were groups like the Free Software Foundation, the Electronic Frontier Fund Foundation, John Perry Barlow is probably their patron saint when he wrote the 1996 Declaration of Independence for Cyberspace, which basically told the government to get out of the way. This is the sort of transformative self-governing system that doesn't need government, that just gets in the way. Next would be what we would call social engineers. These are like cyber libertarians, but they, in the sense that they also believe the internet is this transformative revolution, but they're much more willing to see a role for government in addressing what they see as some of the major problems, things like privacy, net neutrality, how corporations are using digital content. They distrust both government and corporations, really the latter. And groups that would fall into that category would be CDT, Center for Digital Democracy, Electronic Privacy Information Center, Free Press, individuals, people like Tim Wu, Larry Lessig, Yochai Benkler, MIT's David Reed, and I'll go into a little bit more detail a little later. But essentially, these are folks who think that the internet is an empowering thing, but there needs to be a strong role for government to keep it that way. Third group would be what we would call free marketers. These would be groups who think that the internet is again, a transformative, revolutionary technology that enables new kinds of industries, new kinds of business models, but are generally skeptical of the need for much government involvement there. These would be groups like Progress and Freedom, Cato Institute, and the Technology Policy Institute. Although within that there's a difference, again, in terms of views, but generally in that category. Fourth group would be, for lack of a better word, technology moderates. These are folks who are unabashedly pro-IT. They see it as a driving force for economic growth and social progress, but they also would argue that there is a role for government to play some role, not just in terms of moderating potential abuses, but also in actively promoting, if you will, an industrial policy for the internet. I remember Adam and I had a debate about that 10 years ago. In other words, that they would see more of an active role, for example, government spurring smart grid or spurring health IT, areas like that. The fifth group would be what we would call moral conservatives. These are groups who see the internet as a dangerous place, full of risks, and unlike free marketers, these folks who generally would be seen on the right of the political spectrum have no qualms about enlisting government to regulate what they see as a very problematic area. These are folks that were behind the Communications Decency Act, COPPA, internet filtering, and other kinds of activities. Next group is what we would call old economy regulators. These are a group that says there's nothing really different about the internet. It's just a technology like any other technology, sort of like the phone system. And they essentially would see that there's no real harm in government regulating the internet the way it was regulating other things. So we see them in the terms of law enforcement officials trying to impose encryption, open up encryption and other kinds of technologies. Certainly some folks who would maybe perhaps want to see broadband put into the Title II category. Second to last would be tech companies and trade associations. When I did this first version of this about a decade ago, we actually had two groups in this category. One was established companies and the other were sort of newbies, and this time we've merged them together because they're really, in our view, and Morgan's going to talk more about this, there's not a lot of difference in between tech companies now in Washington, whether they're old established companies like IBM or relatively newcomers like Facebook or Google. And I say there's not a lot of difference. They certainly have different positions. I don't mean to deny that, but there really isn't a lot of difference in terms of how they operate or how they think about it. Most tech companies are looking at these issues from a pragmatic perspective. They don't have the ideological slant that perhaps some of the other groups I just listed do. And they're looking at it in a much more sense of how can regulation or no regulation, or government action or no government action, be either advantageous or detrimental to their business model. And the last group would be what we would call bricks and mortars. These would be conventional, if you will, old economy companies including companies, professional associations, unions. So these would be groups like retailers, car dealers, wine wholesalers, real estate agents, unions representing them, who fear that the internet is making their business model obsolete, and they have no qualms about enlisting the aid of government to keep that from happening. We see that in the battles over internet sales taxes, and most recently we see an interesting case in California where the grocery store workers are looking to make self-service grocery checkout illegal, or at least say problematic. I don't know how many of you use self-service grocery checkout, but I do it once in a while, but these folks don't really like it because it threatens their jobs, so they want the state to intervene to protect them. So how do we think about these groups? I would argue there's really two big differentiating factors on these groups. One would be what I would say this continuum of individual empowerment versus social benefit. What do I mean by that? There's a tension between all public policy, but certainly internet policy, between individualism and what Taxonomy once coined as communitarianism, where the former focuses principally on individual rights. You see every policy through the lens of how does it affect my individual rights, and the latter, communitarianism, focusing on how does it affect the community benefits like economic growth, like security, like quality of life. And what we see is that a lot of these debates, for example, when you look at net neutrality, a lot of the net neutrality debate really boils down to this fundamental debate. Is the network about individual freedom, individuals being able to do whatever they want and not having this communitarian interest, i.e. the ISP, intervene in what might be the best of it to maximize social welfare, or is it really all about individual freedom? So in other words, just using a hypothetical case, if the ISPs manage their networks so that they inhibited bandwidth hogs, somebody may be downloading a pirated copy of Lord of the Rings, maybe they couldn't get their copy as quickly, and that made the network work really well for 95% of the other people. The folks on the communitarian side would say that's good, that's improving life for 95% of the people, and the 5% of the bandwidth hogs or pirate downloaders, their life is a little worse. The folks on the individualist side would say, no, we cannot accept that because we see the internet really as fundamentally a liberty enhancement thing, a liberating thing, that we have to focus on individual freedom. And then the last differentiating factor would be over laissez-faire versus government regulation, which is sort of an obvious one in Washington. But a lot of groups differ fundamentally on really how much the internet should be governed. Is it something that should be totally laissez-faire, should be free? A lot of cyber libertarians and to some extent free marketers believe the internet should be governed by its users. Other folks, moral conservatives, social engineers, old economy regulators would be on the other side of that spectrum saying, no, we think that there's a real role for government here to protect people, to limit abuses, and then you have moderates and tech companies in the middle. So what I do in this report is we go through, we lay out that framework, and then we say, let's sort of see how that plays out in some important policy debates in Washington today in these spaces. And so we go through 4 issues: privacy, internet sales tax, net neutrality, and copyright. And I won't go through all 4. Let me just go through a couple quickly: copyright and net neutrality. If you're interested in the other one, I encourage you to look at the report. Basically, I think when you think about copyright, it has both of these factors. Should the government be active, or should we leave it up to the market? And is copying all about collective benefits, or is it about individual freedom? Cyber libertarians see this as essentially that non-commercial file sharing is a form of fair use. In other words, this is something that individuals have the right to do when we're in a situation where individual rights are paramount. So, for example, you see the Electronic Freedom Foundation's Let the Music Play campaign, which was essentially a protest of the music and film industry's prosecution of copiers. The notion is you should really be free to do what you want on the internet. information should be free. As Larry Lessig once said, copying is like breathing to a computer network, like breathing is to us. And then on sort of siding with them on that side of the copyright argument of debate would be social engineers who have the same generalized view, but also have a slightly different view, which is social engineers, like the Larry Lessigs of the world, the Banklers of the world. Their worry is that big corporations who control copyright essentially will restrict what you can do. They'll restrict fair use. They will oppose technologies that will limit mode shifting and time shifting and other kinds of freedoms. They'll permit ISPs to block content. This debate now we have over the Leahy-Hatch bill, which is essentially a bill to allow government to form a blacklist of egregious copyright violation sites that are just there for really one purpose and one purpose only, and that's to distribute copywritten materials illegally. We see that debate exactly played out that way, which are the folks on the social engineers and the cyber libertarians saying this is a violation of what the internet's basic core principle is about, which is communication, which is about liberty, which is about openness and freedom. And on the other side, where I would put ITIF, but certainly other groups, and certainly some in the industry, particularly the copyright, wait a minute, this is about balance. This is about one kind of violation that limits the overall ecosystem, and therefore we have to have control over it. With their emphasis, another group, with their emphasis on property rights, most free market groups would side on the side that says, wait a minute, copying illegally is wrong, it's a violation of property rights, and therefore we need an active government role here, at least to enable copyright holders to go after violations. Finally, bricks and mortar companies, I think, are interesting in this space, whether it's the Recording Industry Association of America or MPA or individual companies, have somewhat modified or evolved their views. Initially, one could argue a decade ago they were in a position of developing technologies that would stop this, or like the original Holland bill, if folks remember that from a decade ago, tech mandates, or even opposing particular technologies. There was at one point a fight by the industry to stop MP3 players, the Rio MP3 case a long time ago. But really, the industry is by and large evolved away from that and is now much more focused on how can we actually just fight copyright actions as opposed to reshape the overall IT ecosystem. And then last would be high-tech companies who are not copyright holders. High-tech companies would essentially, in that they essentially, their major concern in this space is they're afraid that government's going to take actions that are really going to limit their business model, whether that's expensive technology mandates or other kinds of mandates that would affect how they can run their businesses. So I think when you look at copyright, you end up with a much sort of clearer space there, and it helps. I think it helps enable figuring out that what these debates appear to be is really on one level not exactly what they're about. They're really in many ways about this notion of what is the internet really all about? Is it about a communications medium where people need to be free and have individual rights? Or is the internet really about a collective resource that we use to promote economic growth and quality of life? The last issue I want to talk about briefly is net neutrality. You can't really have a debate or discussion about internet policy in Washington without getting into net neutrality. Perhaps this is the most contentious issue, although maybe if I'm feeling optimistic, one could say in the last 6 months we're beginning to see a little bit more of a movement towards some consensus on it. But again, social engineers, cyber libertarians, they view the internet as this mechanism for individual freedom and communication. So anything that would violate that, anything that would make that at risk, including things like managed networks or things like prioritization or network management in and of itself, are seen by them as essentially a threat to that. On top of that, you have groups like social engineers who fundamentally don't trust big corporations, see that the interests of big corporations are antithetical to the interests of the average person. And so they see that the Internet's unique nature is now under threat by the forces of big broadband, the telecom and cable companies, etc. Free marketers see the issue a little bit differently. I think we've seen that recently in the debate in Congress over whether we're going to pass a sort of very streamlined, modified net neutrality bill that at one time looked like it might be possible for the election and now isn't. There we see free marketers seeing net neutrality as just one more attack by government, by big government regulators on the Internet. This was essentially this technology that emerged without a lot of government intervention. Although I have to say, I remember one dinner I was at recently where I won't say who it was, but it was nobody in this room. But it was from a think tank. It's a conservative think tank, and it sort of reminded me of a statement of we should get the government out of my Medicare. It was the person was saying how the Internet didn't come from government. That was something that the private sector created, except for ARPANET and DARPA and a few other minor details like that that actually maybe were related to government. But most free marketers obviously understand where the Internet came from. Their view, though, is that it's a system that's working pretty well now, and that market forces, by and large, are enough really to minimize and handle any abuses. Clearly, technology companies are split on this issue depending upon what their business is. Network providers obviously want the freedom to manage networks and engage in two-sided pricing arrangements and other kinds of practices, whereas other kinds of companies, particularly on the application side, are more worried about that, and that fight is essentially about business models, as Morgan will allude to. Although even there we see some evidence of compromise or progress. The recent Google-Verizon master plan to take over the world. Oh no, wait, no, I think it was just a meeting of the principals. We see that with two companies that initially seemed far apart, and by working collectively over 9-10 months, we're able to come up with somewhat of a consensus document. So, and finally, moderates would see the Internet essentially as a work in progress, that it's continuing to evolve, that network management, two-sided pricing, other kinds of changes and innovations are ultimately probably beneficial, but that doesn't mean that anything goes and that there should be no government involvement. It's how do you set up a framework to limit abuses. So again, I think when you look at these issues, again, we see the same thing with privacy, and we see the same thing with internet sales tax. We see the same thing with many, many issues in the internet. That each of these groups have their own very, very strongly held views. I think our views, I would argue, are as strongly held as anybody's, and Adam's views and Morgan's views, and certainly everybody's views, I think, are well-intentioned, but many of them stem from fundamentally different places, fundamentally different goals at the end of the day of what is trying to be accomplished. And I think it's important to get underneath that and to figure out a little more in depth and a little more granularly about how those goals play out, and I think it helps to then explain some of these debates. So with that, I'll stop and then turn it over to Morgan.
This one hopefully works, right? So I think it's interesting, as a member of one of Rob's groups, I feel that I get some kind of special permission or rights based on my being part of a specialized class. But I think what's interesting is within the context of both the list of groups and overall in Washington, there's a phrase that we've often heard around town, and that's where you stand depends on where you sit. But what's interesting about that is I took some time to actually look at the origin of that. And in 1949, a manager within the budget office had an employee come to him asking his advice regarding a job that he had been offered within an agency that the employee had recommended for budget cuts. The manager, a man named Rufus Miles, advised him to take the job, and he did. Miles noted that another colleague that he had expected within a month or two, the employee would be bitterly complaining about the very cuts he had advocated for. The colleague thought it would be impossible, knowing the strength of character of his friend. Miles said that it should be expected that he would change his tune, and if he didn't, Miles would be disappointed. Miles said that in order to be effective internally, he needed to be a strong advocate in its external affairs. He quipped, "Where you stand depends on where you sit," and thus was born Miles' Law. While Rufus Miles may have made that statement in Washington in 1949, it rings just as true today when we look at the tech lobby. For tech companies of today, where they stand on public policy positions almost always is a function of where they sit in their current business model. Rob's paper does a great job of breaking down the groups and outlining the ideologies behind it. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time digging down on the group that I belong to and the group that I work with, the Technology Trade Association and the industry writ large. I think that we all assume that companies do what's in their shareholders' best interests. But I think the area that raises the greatest concern for us is watching the blurring of the lines where the business model interest is cloaked with the rhetoric of strictly a public policy outcome. And I would take those of you who have your MBA or have done your time in the trenches with the old 4 Ps, you know, the marketing mix of product, price, promotion, and placement. And if you look at today's internet economy, we notice that there are essentially 4 major software distribution models on the internet today. We've got license of specific software under the copyright that Rob just spoke of. Giveaway software to sell hardware. Apple does that to some extent, either gives it away or underprices it. IBM has been a quintessential master at that with some of their mainframes. We have giveaway software to generate services. That's IBM's current business model. That was Sun's before they got bought by Oracle, and that's Red Hat's model. And then giveaway software to sell ads and collect user information, and that's Google, Yahoo, AOL, and others. So you've got these very 4 distinct business models that look differently when it comes to product, price, promotion, and placement. So that's your standard grid of marketing speak, MBA talk. But the question that really gets raised now is what's the 5th P? And that's public policies that help or harm business models. So, for example, in the debate that we just heard Rob talk about, you know, the folks who license or sell software, they're strong proponents of the DMCA. They definitely feel the DMCA helps them. They're looking at it as an opportunity to make sure that their product line is sold. But for other groups that want to encourage government preferences for open software or for other technologies, they probably see the DMCA as a disadvantage. So within the confines of Rob's groups, you'll see these 2 groups come to a very different conclusion, and who they're likely to support within the other 7 groupings that Rob outlined. They're going to change who they support based on where their business model is. For those who give away software to sell advertising, you've noticed that a very different outcome when it comes to questions about privacy regulation or impacts on net neutrality. All of it is raised in a different frame of reference depending on what your business model is. I think, you know, a good example, and since it's everybody's topic du jour on net neutrality, is to look back at the 700 megahertz spectrum auction, where a internet company, Google, advocated for a public policy position on the 700 megahertz spectrum. Now, on the face of it, why would that happen? What was their goal? What was their interest? Well, they were looking to see a chunk of spectrum that would be assured that the government would ensure would be open for third-party applications, for the collection of data on users, and for the ability to offer new services, new applications, new devices like the Android, and not have to worry about specific deals with carriers. So they went about lobbying from a public policy position that the internet needed this 700 megahertz spectrum for openness reasons. And those of you who are around will recall some of their quotes. But what I thought was very interesting was the quotes that were said after the FCC put the auction forth. I thought this was interesting. A gentleman from Stanford said, if Google had won a license, and those of you who recall, the auction was set forth by the FCC, it was set to be open, and then it had a minimum price point of $4.6 billion. And Google was expected to, and it had agreed to, with the FCC to bid on it. Well, the Friday after the bid came out, there was a great quote by one Google executive who said, it was a bit of a tense weekend after we put in our $4.6 billion bid, not because they were afraid they would lose the bid, but they were afraid they would actually win the bid. So Google had met the number, had put in $4.6 billion bid for the spectrum. But from their viewpoint, they wanted a policy outcome and didn't want to have to pay for it. Fortunately, Verizon stepped up, bid a higher price, bought the spectrum, and has figured out their own way to utilize it, or is trying to. But the point was, Google approached the situation not from the perspective of how do we make money out of this spectrum, how do we build it ourselves, how do we buy it, acquire the licenses and push it out into the place, but how do we affect public policy to get our business outcome, which is open spectrum available for third-party devices and data collection. Well, that to us is probably the most. It's a well-practiced art in Washington, D.C., but I would say that it's one of the more significant changes that we've seen in terms of the high-tech sector. That companies and trade associations are working very hard to make sure that their public policy argument that benefits their business model is cloaked in rhetoric of openness, of inclusivity, of public good. And within ACT, we've actually tried to both, and to use the phrase, embrace and extend on that. We start every discussion we have internally about a paper we're going to write or a statement we're going to say with the premise of, how does this help our members? We start every discussion with that. And so when I walk into a meeting with a congressional staffer or a reporter, what should be on the tip of my tongue is, this is how my membership, small, medium-sized software companies, benefit from this public policy initiative. And so I would say that for folks who are in the administration or in the legislative branches, that you should be caveat legislator, in a sense. When a technology company or a trade association or one of the other 7 groups that Rob talked about comes in to discuss with you something that's for the public good, for the kids, that you start with the principle of, what's their business model? How does their 4 Ps grid work out? And how does this 5th P of public policy benefit them? So I think that, that is, in a nutshell, how our 1/8 of Rob's grid tends to see the world, and I think is pretty illustrative for the rest of the industry. And with that, I'll turn it over to Adam.
Thanks, Morgan. Point I should have made about Adam before I didn't. One of the reasons we asked Adam to be on the panel, besides just he has this really
awesome.
long background and great intellect on this, is he's actually written his own several papers on this, which I encourage you to look at, that have attempted to also come up with a typology, which I think is also quite effective at describing the space here. So.
Well, thank you, Rob. I want to thank you and ITIF for inviting an out-of-work think tank fun like me here for the show. As you can see, I've already sold all my nice clothes and my razor, and I'm on my way to being a mountain man. I'm just here to line my pockets with bagels and cookies, basically. No, really, I'm here to talk about what is a really outstanding paper. I think Rob's done a great job with this paper, and he was kind enough to share an earlier draft with me, and I made some comments on it. And actually, I can't believe he actually accepted most of them by putting the subtitle. Nobody listens to me, Rob. This is great. But if there's one thing I've learned about Rob, it's that he loves taxonomies, and I do too, and I think this is a pretty good one. But I do have some nitpicks with a couple of the categories that I'll walk through briefly, and they're just a few, but I'll start with the one I know the best, which is cyber libertarianism and free marketeers, which are 2 distinct categories in Rob's taxonomy, but I think these 2 categories are virtually synonymous, and I'm not quite sure why they were necessarily 2. In fact, they might be able to be collapsed into one. I think what Rob means by cyber libertarianism, as he defines in the paper, is really what we call in the field of cyber law internet exceptionalism, which is that there's something really truly unique and different about the internet, and that it should be treated differently than other technologies or whatever else. It was almost a quasi-infant industry for a while. It's taken far less seriously today as a distinct school of philosophical thought about the internet. And I really think that cyber libertarianism, at least as I've tried to hopefully do a little bit to redefine it, my colleagues and I, Baron Soka, we've written on this extensively and tried to say that really they're one and the same, with the exception of the one sticky issue that really does divide cyber libertarianism from free marketeers, which is copyright and patent policy, which is almost like the abortion issue for libertarians. It really divides the libertarians and the free marketeers in a very clear way. But besides that, there's nothing but, I think, consensus on most issues. Second thing I want to comment on is Rob's category of moral conservatives. I think this category is actually a much broader category. It should be. It might be called the social order category, or just cyber conservatives. because it's not just about the child safety or free speech issues. It's really more broadly about a conservative worldview of safety and stability. And it's strange that there's not really any mention there of cybersecurity. I mean, the fastest growing category, I think, of this tech taxonomy is really this sort of new form of social stability, conservatism about security and safety issues, with a whole lot of books being written about cyber warfare right now and things like that. So I would have liked to see that category broadened a bit to be more along the lines of traditional conservatism. Third, I love this category of social engineers. That's a great moniker. I'm going to start using it myself. But the problem is that there's many, many flavors of social engineering. And I think Rob's been a little bit unfair here to group some of these folks together. And I'll just use the example of Free Press versus CDT, who both appear on the list. I mean, Free Press takes social engineering of the internet to all new levels. It's more like I would call maybe cyber Stalinist, with all apologies to Joe Stalin. Free Press is in a totally different realm of social engineering of the internet. There isn't any area of it that they don't want command and control regulation. CDT, by contrast, is very much more about individual empowerment and about trying to find constructive solutions that don't always involve heavy-handed government intervention, unlike Free Press. So I would say they need a little caution there about who we define as a social engineer, or at least how they go about doing it. There's also, I should mention, a lot of overlap between the social engineers and the old economy regulators. I asked Rob why he didn't include mention of Michael Kopp somewhere in this paper, and the epitome of the old economy regulator, in my opinion. But he's also some partly social engineer. So a lot of overlap there. Fourth category of moderates is to me just a bit too amorphous of a category, and it's an ever-changing one, and it's very issue-specific. I mean, I'm a moderate on some issues, although I'm a lunatic on most others. But the reality is that depending on the issue you pick, you could be a moderate in a given day of the week. And I think Rob created this category because he wanted to put himself into it. And say, look at me, look at ITF, we're the pragmatic moderate ones. We will strike the right Solomonic balance on all these cyber issues. And maybe he will, but there are times when Rob's pretty hardcore too. Some of the privacy issues and other things like that. So I think that category is very, very amorphous. So more broadly, thinking about the taxonomy that Rob's created, I think given that these intersections that I've described between some of these categories or groups, I would have liked to see Rob create some sort of Venn diagrams showing how much overlap there is between the different species here. Because again, I think cyber libertarians and free marketeers, near perfect overlap, maybe 10% no, a little bit less overlap between social engineers and old economy regulators, but still some. Maybe the other approach would have been a spectrum of views, and plotting the views upon it might have been an interesting addition to the paper. I think it would have also been very, very interesting to hear Rob have some discussion in this paper about who's winning. I certainly have some views on this, and I believe that the social engineers, or what I've called in my own taxonomy, cyber collectivists, they're winning this debate hands down, especially in academia. There isn't any doubt that social engineering is on the rise, and that cyber libertarianism and some of these other schools of thinking, free marketeer, are waning rapidly. So I would have liked to see Rob's assessment of who stands where in terms of who's winning this intellectual battle. Finally, on the dividing lines between these different schools, I really do like the two axes that Rob came up with: individual empowerment versus social benefit, and laissez-faire versus government regulation. Those are really good. I think those are two dividing lines. I'd suggest one third one, and it's something that Rob alluded to that I've written a lot about, which is the broadest of all dividing lines would be internet optimist versus internet pessimist or skeptic. And there's a really long and rich history of internet skepticism out there, starting really with Neil Postman in the mid-90s with his book Technopoly and Amusing Ourselves to Death. And he'd started a rich tradition of technological skepticism that continues today with people like Lee Siegel, Mark Halperin, Andrew Keen, Jerome Lanier, Nick Carr. There is a really a large and growing body of literature and writing that is dealing with sort of this inherent skepticism about the benefits of the internet and cyberspace. Now, there are plenty of people pushing back who are optimistic about the benefits of the internet, but I think I would have liked to see maybe another axis there that said, who's on this optimist versus pessimist divide. And the pessimist really, it's a combination of a little bit of old economy regulator, a little bit of bricks and mortar, a little bit of social or more conservative, but it's something more than that. It's this question of are we better off because of the existence of this thing called the internet? And there are a lot of skeptics out there who would say no, we're not. That for a lot of reasons, and it's not just specific sectoral ones because of business, it's a broader one about its impact on culture, on society, on language, on reading, on all sorts of things. I can't tell you how many books I have on my shelf on this optimist versus pessimist shelf, with titles on the pessimist side like The End of Reading, the end of literature, the end of, and it really is pretty dour stuff, and then on the other side there's these Pollyannas who say, no, it's all wine and roses, everything's great, and I'm somewhere more in the middle. I'm a moderate, Rob. Well, I'm a moderate. I'm what I call a pragmatic optimist, and I believe that on that we are better off because of the internet and technology and cyberspace. But this is a really healthy and interesting part of the debate. I'm hoping to actually make it the next book I write. I think I found a publisher for it. And believe it or not, I'm actually trying to interview the ultimate internet pessimist skeptic. I'm trying to go out to Supermax Prison and interview Ted Kaczynski. We've been growing the funny facial here. Because nobody has written more eloquently about the evils of technology than Ted, even though people have never taken it seriously. It's something to be reread and pondered, because he points to a lot of the criticisms of the net that we see other people making, albeit in a slightly less extreme way, not sending mail bombs, but there's a tradition there, and I think it's an interesting one. So those are just a few of my thoughts on what are otherwise a really outstanding paper I read today, Rob, on it. Oh, sorry.
Did you get an interview?
Not yet. It's hard to figure out how to interview someone Superman.
Well, I'll just give a few observations as somebody.
They use email.
I don't think they can make a computer.
Well, I'll just offer a few observations as somebody who's covered, tech and telecom issues since the 96 Telecom Act. First of all, I think the issues have gotten much more complex than they were back in the late 90s. The big issue seemed to be, the fight over encryption restrictions and privacy and the cyber sins, as I used to like to call them, internet gambling, internet porn, and then of course privacy, which has remained an issue as it was back then and is now. And another observation I have is just the changing groups in town. We've seen some contraction since the dot-com bust. You had, of course, most recently PFL fold, but in recent years we've seen EIA disbanded. You've seen AEA, which had been around for many years, merge with ITIA to become Tech America. And so we've seen that kind of change. And it seems to me that the groups that have survived have sort of cut out a niche. ITIC, which is right across the hall from here, represents a lot of the hardware companies and has focused on issues like STEM education, trade barriers, the R&D tax credit and other tax issues. And then you have groups like CCIA, which I think is kind of an interesting group in the sense the issues they've focused on. They've been aggressive on net neutrality, issues like that. Have favored some antitrust actions, most recently against Intel. Obviously, AMD is a member of their group. And then another observation I have is just the emergence of single-issue groups. We've most recently seen that on the white spaces issue, the Wireless Innovation Alliance, which emerged a few years ago, sprang up to help shape that order out of the FCC. You've seen like Google join with BD Access Project. Who else was on that? Public Knowledge to help shape that order. Then you have on net neutrality, you have the Open Net Coalition, which is in favor of net neutrality rules. And on the other side, you have Scott Freeland's group, netcompetition.org, which represented a lot of the broadband providers. So those are just some of my observations on the political landscape as far as tech and telecom companies. So I'm just going to end it at that.
thank you. We can dig a little more into that in the Q&A, but let me just, I guess, quickly respond to, principally to Adam. I appreciate Juliana and Morgan's comments. I think they're right on the mark about how the changing landscape, if you will, on the business side and on the advocacy group side. I think, you know, Adam, with regard to your comment about cyber libertarian, partly that's I guess maybe the confusion there is somewhat terminology, because I know libertarianism has a particular term, and so whether it's, we debated internally whether to call it internet exceptionalism or not. I do think there are a little more differences than you would say, other than just copyright. For example, on net neutrality, I think the motivation is different between net neutrality. The free marketers would be that the government shouldn't be doing anything, whereas I think the internet exceptionalists or cyber libs or whatever we want to call it, they would be more. They would be saying the government should be involved. I think there are more dividing lines than you might suggest. That suggests that there's probably two categories there. On the conservative, on the moral conservative thing, you're right. We should have put more in security. We alluded to it in one of the discussions later, but you're right. The whole sort of broad notion of sort of conservatism being, who was that great guy in the 50s who wrote about conservatism? Russell Kirk. I mean, it's sort of that notion of conservatism is something in the past was better than what we have today, and the future will be even worse. That is embedded in that whole concept, the moral part of it being with regard to, say, content, and pornography is only one component of that. The moderate versus, this is one of my category. I originally called that category pragmatic category, but Adam was kind enough to point out that was somewhat snarky, because certainly other groups are pragmatic as well. But you know, I needed a place for me, and I couldn't just put the ITIF category. That was it. But a little more seriously, I do think that there is a unique category. It's not just me. You know, I sort of put Jim Lewis in that category with CSIS. I mean, folks who are generally pro-technology as opposed to some of the, I think, the social engineers and we'll get into the pessimism part in a minute, and also are, you know, pro-market and pro-government, if you will. You know, looking for an activist role for government to support the digital ecosystem, but avoiding the other. On your point about academia and who's winning and who's losing, I certainly think in the academy that it's become a bastion of social engineers when it comes to this position. Not to say that there aren't other people of other stripes in there, but the voice that you hear out of the academy largely is a social engineering voice, I would argue. And I don't know why that is. Just, you know, the water they drink in universities or what's going on. But I see that much more than I did 10 years ago. And lastly, I think on your optimism, you're absolutely right. I think this paper would have been better if it had to add a third, you know, almost like a three-dimensional box, if you will, on optimism and pessimism, because I think that is a very important dividing line that we should have mentioned. We alluded to it, but we didn't really articulate it clearly. Because at the end of the day, a lot of it does boil down to, you know, are you willing to take a risk and say, you know what, let's step forward into that future, or are you much more cautious and say no? I mean, I put Nick Carr totally in that category. And Nick Carr is sort of the internet pessimist par excellence. It's making you stupid. In a few years, the cloud is going to be a publicly regulated utility because it's going to turn into a cloud monopoly. If you read his Nick Carr's book about what's next.
Big switch.
The big switch. The big switch is we're going from a competitive marketplace to a totally monopolistic one. The evidence of that is where, Nick? And IT doesn't matter. So he's made a business out of being an internet contrarian because that stuff sells. I'm sort of less worried about those folks because those folks do it because that's how they make money. And get their name and get good speeches for lots of money. Because if you say, hey, you know, the internet is really this cool thing, and cloud's going to be kind of the same as it is now, it's only a little different, and the internet's driving economic transformation, and actually the internet's sort of making you a little smarter, who's going to listen to that speech or read that book? Nobody. What I worry about more is the media, because what I see in story after story after story is essentially if not one-sided, 90% sided. A wonderful example I had a few years ago, a story on RFID, radio frequency identification device. That was an issue that maybe 5 years ago had a lot of attention, and now sort of, as people realize that, you know, your little Metro card is not, you're not going to be tracked by stalkers because you have a little wireless Metro card. You know, I can scan you right now, Morgan, but I'm not going to. I remember an article by the LA Times where a reporter interviewed me for at least an hour on RFID. Sort of went through the engineering of it. The read rates are, the read distances are about 6 inches. I mean, anybody can try to, I can't even get in the door here in the morning sometimes if my key is not, like, you know, right jammed against the reader. So I'm anxiously awaiting a story, and the story comes out, and she extensively quotes Catherine Albrecht, who is an anti-RFID advocate who believes, has written in her book that the government, literally in her book, Spy Chips, that the government has a secret plan to forcibly implant tracking chips in every American body. She gets,
or has already.
well, exactly. The plan is there. She gets the press, and I don't. Now, I'm not sort of, I don't care whether I'm there. I'm not sort of, you know, crying over spilled milk here. My point of the article was 100% why RFID is a bad technology when we track. I actually expect the media to have higher standards than that. A really great case in point is what I would call the unscientific American. Scientific American, I used to read it. Now I don't. I only read it now when people point out these articles. But it used to be it used to pride itself on being an objective publication. Scientific American had an issue maybe a year ago on privacy, and Catherine Albrecht writes a long, long screed about this. The security guy who's cyber Bruce Schneier. Bruce Schneier is a very biased analyst, very biased. And you can argue whether you like him or you don't. But Bruce Schneier has a very, very distinct point of view on security that is certainly not uniformly held by internet and computer security experts. Bruce Schneier, I believe, gets an article. Catherine Albrecht gets an article. And most recently, the Scientific American piece on broadband competition and net neutrality. Just, I mean, I would have expected this out of a free press paper, not out of Scientific American. So I guess that's really what worries me more, is how the media has bought into this cyber pessimism, and sort of every article has to be. And I think that's probably just maybe because, you know, the media needs to sell stuff, and it's hard for them to make a living now, and so you're going to kind of go to the lowest common denominator. But I do think it leads us into the wrong direction. So I probably should. I don't. By the way, I don't put National Journal into that category. I think,
A media nice.
Yeah.
they call it as they see it.
Are journalists just born skeptics anyways? I mean, that's our job. I mean, we're supposed to question that.
Well, but I would argue that journalists should be born skeptical of people who are selling a totally negativist solution. That's, you know, I don't imply that journalism should be cheerleaders, nor should they be total pessimists. I guess I'm just saying any story needs to really include both sides and do it fairly. And by the way, I don't get me wrong. There are lots of journalists who do that still. There are lots of publications like the Journal who does that still. But there are many stories that don't, and there are some publications that just do this, you know, pretty consistently, and that's just one way.
Well, Rob, what you're getting at is the fact that fear sells, and, you know, it's a model that has been out there for a long time, and, you know, it leads is, you know, is a different way. I guess it's the cyber version of that, what you're describing. Because the hysteria about this sort of worrywart hand-wringing about our cyber future being much worse than our cyber past is one, it's a string that you see, a thread that you see throughout a lot of the work here. And you asked, well, why is it that the social engineers may be dominating in the ivory towers? I think it's partly because they have a different scary story that they tell. It's this sort of death of internet openness, and, you know, we're having walled gardens erected. I mean, if you read the three most important works of cyber law that have been written over the last 10 years, I think of them as a trilogy, are really Lessig's Code, Zittrain's Future of the Net, and the new Tim Wu book that is about to come out called Master Switch, which I've just finished reading. And, you know, these books tell a really awful story about how the internet is going to be held captive to evil corporate nefarious interests, and, you know, it'll become more regulable, as Zittrain calls it, because you'll have all this surveillance and everybody will be tracking us. And, you know, there's a spooky story there about death of openness, death of privacy, death of everything. That is going to sell. That's going to be a compelling argument when you take that to people, because it's got a, you know, it's like I call it the Mr. Burns sort of story for the internet. You know, plotting to take away your rights. You know, it's the cartoon character kind of vision that Zittrain and Lessig has. And, you know, what was Lessig's great villain? It was AOL. It was going to monopolize the world, and walled gardens would go up around us. And 10 years later, you know, AOL, okay, well, it's Facebook. You know, Facebook's going to do it. And it's like, pick your villain du jour and your scary, spooky story and construct a narrative around it. And it's very hard for someone who's optimistic like me or pragmatic like you, whatever. You know, the fact is pushing back against that. We're not going to have an equally sexy story necessarily that's going to sell as well as the gloom and doomsday one that they have. So I think, unfortunately, we're going to be up against this for some time.
And I think there's two reasons behind what you're saying. One of which is a business model reason, which is if you look at how academics are successful, openness is their primary source of income. They receive, you know, the old publisher perish rule. You need to have your book read. You need to have your book cited. You need to have more academics talking about the work you're doing. That increases your opportunity for better advancement either within a university or moving to a better university. So they have a strong business case to be made that sacrificing everything to preserve knowledge openness or free access to my material is beneficial to their bottom line. I think the other problem that we all face, and Rob described it well with the problem of the article, is something that Julian Sanchez has written about called the one-way hash problem. That if you're able to define an argument on the front side of it and give it a clever one-line phrase to define how it moves forward, if it's easy to absorb, if it's easy for somebody to absorb, even if it's wrong, the difficulty in correcting that opinion ends up being a one-way hash, meaning that to break apart that misconception, you not only have to correct the facts, but you also have to tell the person who originally bought the argument that they're an idiot. Mm-hmm. And that is the hardest problem that you face in breaking a one-way hash. It's not information. Rob spent an hour talking to the reporter giving accurate information. But if the reporter had already decided on the information that they wanted to write about, or the academic, telling them or informing them of the details it creates two problems. You know, one, it's difficult, but most importantly, is you're calling them an idiot. And we see that a lot on the net neutrality debate. There is so much anger and energy and misperception about the net neutrality debate that when you go in to talk to a legislator or a regulator about it, with the facts, so to speak, and a very droll, well, this might happen, or this is good, or this is bad, it doesn't inflame the same passions as saying, without net neutrality, we lose internet freedom. All right, I said that was easy. That's the headline. All right, but saying, well, in certain cases, network management has some advantages, and small businesses could benefit if they could do two-tiered pricing, but there might be instances where that's a problem. Well, all of you have just fallen asleep. So as we look at what we're talking about here, I think there are two aspects of it. For the academic community, they have a business case. They have a business case to support a certain kind of openness. And for the broader audience at large, I think you have a one-way hash problem in that the arguments that the other side gets to make on a lot of these issues, the pessimists in particular, are clean, easy to articulate, and quickly easy to understand.
So, unless you want to. So why don't we open it up? If you can hold on until a mic comes around and then identify yourself and give a specific question to somebody or just
Yeah, I'm Brad Cox with NetChoice. We're going to follow up with what you just said there. I think more than just telling the second point, you know, the one-way hash problem is not just saying, you know, having to get around the fact that they're an idiot. It's correcting the facts and then offering a solution of your own. And I think that part of free economic philosophy and kind of libertarianism often fails because we say, well, the market will take care of it. Or innovation will prosper when the government's out of it. We don't put a human face on it. And it's a harder thing to say. It's a little more abstract. And I think that's also a constant problem that the cyber libertarian movement and the free market perspective when it comes to technology faces all the time. That government just stay out a little bit, let the new technologies evolve, and we're going to have a better outcome than if you move in right now. I think that's how do we work beyond that, and how do what kind of data can we get that empirically shows that this is the right path? We don't need to regulate right now.
Well, I just have a quick one on that, and I'll let the other folks answer. Is my quip on that always is that the verb of legislator is to legislate, and the verb of regulator is to regulate. Therefore, when you walk into an audience and say, don't do your job, it's a very hard sell. So I think you're completely right. It's hard to talk to an audience of regulators and legislators and say, do nothing. Go home, watch your soap operas, do not be involved. And that's a really difficult message, and I think you're right.
I don't have much to add to that, except that I think the way that I counter myself is to borrow a page out of what is one of my favorite books about thinking about technology, written by Virginia Pastrell, called The Future and Its Enemies. And she has this classic divide of sort of the dynamist view of the world versus the stasis view. And she describes, how we counter the viewpoint, the one that you just articulated, that others that we've been concerned with, which is by pointing out that, look, it's not that we don't favor doing nothing, it's that we favor doing a lot. It's why we favor experimentation and evolution, not just in the marketplace, but in social mechanisms and norms and everything else. And that the stasis mentality is the one that actually forecloses sort of more innovative solutions and that evolutionary dynamism, if you will, that we should allow for, especially in terms of technology, because technology, the key thing about technology that makes some people skeptical or concerned or hand-wringers is that it's fundamentally disruptive. And you have to talk people through how that will ultimately be beneficial to them, and that it will be better for society and culture and economy, and that we should allow for that. And that doesn't mean doing nothing. It means allowing people to do a lot, everybody to do a lot.
We'll go to Will and then Link, but Will here. But just a quick response on that. I think the other big problem is that it's very, when you're trying to solve a problem and you're in Congress and administration, your job is to solve a problem, and the easiest way to solve a problem is to dictate or just, that really is about, I think, when we saw in cap and trade, is a lot of the people who wanted cap and trade were like, global warming is a big, big problem. We have to solve it. We'll solve it by a rule, as opposed to we'll solve it by creating an innovation system that enables new innovations to occur, and it might solve it and it might not. And I think that goes back to this optimist-pessimist thing when you're saying, well, net neutrality, we could, as a moderate, I'd say we could put a couple little tweaks in here and that's probably going to make the innovation system work well, but it's not assured. And I think it's the assurance that a lot of people in this debate are looking for, which I would argue is when you get assurance, you limit other things from happening. Well, Bruin?
Yeah, thanks. Will Roger, LNG. I think all four of you this morning have directly or indirectly addressed the evergreen question of dominance in technology markets. Whether you go back to IBM or AT&T, Intel, Microsoft, whether we're talking about the dystopians or the utopians, there's this constant tension between monopoly and free market, tipping points, network effects. We all know how this stuff works. It would seem that everyone in industry and government would then have an interest in the outcome of antitrust investigations, antitrust adjudications, and yet at the same time, as I think Juliana sort of pointed out, there are very few voices in any given antitrust dispute. I wonder if you all might want to talk about the politics of that. Why don't we hear more people supporting or attacking putative monopolist dominant firms?
Well, I don't know. Is that the case, Will? I think
In Washington, D.C.
I think people pick their enemies, right? And obviously, some are going to pick certain characters over others. But I mean, there are people who write about this and people who get pretty passionate about it. I don't know if you've read Gary Reback's new book.
The business lobbies in particular as well.
But the business lobbies, again, they select, they pick their enemies, they figure out who they want to, in my view, hobble through antitrust enforcement, and then they go after them. Now, there might be a different way of viewing that, but I think there are only a handful of people who look at antitrust comprehensively, because again, it gets back into this sort of like where you sit is where you stand or whatever. I mean, that basically dictates what you're going to be view's going to be on antitrust. And if Google's your biggest competitor, that may make you a lot more interested in using antitrust right now, the same way people did against Microsoft in the 90s, right? And IBM in the 80s. So.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, obviously, you look at Microsoft, they'd probably welcome an antitrust suit against Google, but, 10 years ago, obviously, they were on the other side of that. So, I mean, I'm not saying they would, but I mean.
And so why aren't there more voices in defense too? That's just.
In defense of Google?
Yeah, sure.
Well, at a recent hearing that Morgan was at, you had CCIA standing up saying, we're not, we do think antitrust is important, but in this case, we don't think Google is enough of a barrier. Obviously, they were representing, their member company.
I think also it's a more complicated and technocratic issue than net neutrality. That you can just go put a T-shirt on there, but sort of an antitrust thing that says maybe market power exists under these situations is much more inside the beltway kind of technical thing. So, Wayne?
Rob, one of the things in your taxonomy that I think is also a factor here in terms of policymaking and why it's so much more difficult, I think, now than it used to be, is the fact that we've got fragmentation in the sectors. You mentioned, for example, the consumer sector is one of the groups that's sort of in there. And when I started doing these issues 20 years ago, basically it was CFA, Consumers Union a little bit. Today you've got probably a dozen groups in that space that have to do with net neutrality, broadband policy, competition policy. So to some extent, the Hill folks have a really difficult time now because not only do they have a lot of these groups, they actually fight each other. I mean, they actually don't always see eye to eye, at least in terms of political power, who gets to speak. The other point is motivation, and your taxonomy ignores that to some extent because deeper down there's usually something else driving them. It's not just a philosophy. So my belief is, for example, that a lot of what the debate is with free press is more about political power. The internet is a medium for political power. And I think they look at the right and how they took over talk radio, and it really worries them. They really trust companies, so they believe that, in fact, free speech is at stake, but it's really more about political power than it is about speech alone.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the, we're sort of our, in this camp being the culprit of the proliferation of many groups. I mean, we didn't exist 4 or 5 years ago. So I think the fact that there are a lot more groups means there's a lot more voices, and there's a lot more competition among each of the groups to go out and get resources as well, and that certainly drives how people look at it. You want to, as a group, you want to get attention, you want to be out there, and so there's an incentive for everybody to push a little farther maybe than a decade ago when there's a little bit more kind of a gentleman's agreement, if you will, I mean, we see the same thing in Congress, where 2 decades ago, Congress they used to actually talk to one another across parties, and we see a lot less of that today.
Rob, really quick, one thing I failed to mention in my opening remarks that you mentioned Congress, and I think I mentioned in the early draft of your paper. I thought it would have kind of been interesting to see you plot few politicians on this act. As I mentioned, Michael Cobbs and his old boss Fritz Hollins. They're easy to pigeonhole into that old economy regulators category. But there are a lot of flavors of politicians out there on tech policy issues, and it definitely isn't always left-right. So I don't know if in version 3.0 of this paper that's something you might want to consider, but I would have liked to see more discussion about not just think tanks or trade associations, but actual people or politicians.
I'd like to get invited to back to the FCC at some point in the future.
That's a good point.
Yeah. Luke?
Thanks. Stu Graham at U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. So 2 things. One is by way of a comment for Rob. So when I was listening to these 2 continua that you laid out, I was thinking to myself of a website I was perusing recently, politicalcompass.com. And this is certainly not an innovation on their side, but they actually have mapped out these 2 continua with sort of point estimates of where they believe these players are. And it may not be the case in your, and as a spatial thinker, it would just be interesting to see such a thing done. And it may be that some of your players are not on a point, but actually will live anywhere across the alternative continuum of that point, depending, because they don't care about the other aspect as much as they, are completely centered on the one aspect that they care about. But that's just by way of a suggestion. And to comment a bit and ask a question on something that Morgan said, I agree with you that academics care principally about openness, but a phrase that you used at the end of your comment about that, they care about a particular type of openness. I think that's very right. So even in the days before there was an internet, right, we had information overload, and the way in which academics, the institution that developed to weed through that for people was the journal, the rankings of journals, right? So that could serve as a signal of high quality, right? So it's openness, but tempered by some support for entrepreneurial activity in that space, right? So the entrepreneurs, as they always do, waded in to where there were transaction costs. And here was a situation in which there were transaction costs, and entrepreneurs moved in to help solve that. So the question that I have is, given the proliferation of openness, right? How is the system reacting to try to solve that particular problem of quality, right? We've seen it in the past, we see it in other areas, the New York Times serves or other high quality papers have served traditionally as a signal of quality. So how is this working its way out?
Just a quick thing on Political Compass. If you haven't been to Political Compass, I would really encourage you to do it. It's a lot of fun. It's politicalcompass.com, or I don't know what it is. You can just Google it or Bing it or whatever you want to do. You can take this test, and it puts you on a point on this axis. And my son took it, and he was sort of slightly libertarian, like almost right on the line. I was slightly authoritarian, which I thought was good since I was his father. It's fun to take the test. And you're right. I think if you do it, you can find you can put people on various points on this axis, on this plane.
Two things. I think the problem with putting specific politicians or even specific groups on a point in time is it's static. You can find a very conservative member of the Vermont, a legislator from Vermont or a state legislator from Vermont, who will argue vociferously against government interests in any case. But if you ask them about the milk compact, oh boy, that is an important action that the government must take. So I think that it's very difficult to pinpoint how they see the world, because how they see the world changes depending on the issue that they're seeing it about. And so I think I don't think you can. I mean, Rick Boucher, one of the best known on there, you'd have him here on some issues, here on others, here on there. I mean, I wouldn't want to pigeonhole Rick Boucher because I don't think it's easy to do. On the second question about how academics are dealing with openness, I would say that the journals still serve an important function and still there, but I think it's become a world of who shouts the loudest. The smart academics have figured out how to tweet, how to Twitter, how to Facebook, how to write the book, how to get it up there. It is, they have become their own PR engines, and in the case of some of them, they actually have PR teams. If you've ever seen Zittrain give a presentation, he's amazing. He gives great show. So I think what the academic community is doing is that those who can give good show are being rewarded, and I think that also is generating a follow-on effect where a lot of folks who might have said, well, I'm going to write this particular niche of this particular topic, and I'm going to be the best at that niche, are moving rapidly to try to become globalists because nobody's going to pay attention to them if they're just an expert on that niche. And that's when you get this growth, where you take a small theory and grow it out until it covers the entire universe and answers everyone's questions. So I think on the academic front, he who shouts the loudest, or at least gives the best show, is getting the most attention from the academic community.
Trish Remo, freelance writer and publicist. Speaking of biased publications and articles, thinking of the Post article yesterday on Julius Janikowski and how the reporter basically cast him as ineffectual and saying that he's not been able to push through any policies. His agency now has far less regulatory authority than in the past. And then next to it you have Rob Atkinson saying he needs to get off the pot on net neutrality. And I was really disappointed in that. I thought and I found myself as a publicist wondering who had tried to place that article and what they had tried to get out of it. And if so, what was their reaction? So does any of you have a comment on that?
Well, I'd like to be quoted by the Washington Post, so I'm not going to say anything.
Anyone wants to take a hand up on that?
I'm the host, I probably should. I don't see Cecilia that way. I mean, I didn't read the article in depth. I've read Rob's piece, which I'll talk about in a second. So I see Cecilia calling it kind of the way she sees it. I don't 100% agree with everything she says, but in general, I think she tries to do a pretty good job. I put her in the Juliana category. Rob, I did not. I think when you read his piece, he's good at telling you whether you should buy an iPod or a Dell or something like that. Whether you should buy the Android phone or the BlackBerry. I mean, I'd rely on it for that, but that's about it. I would not rely on it for this. If you read his piece on Sunday, it was chock full of factual mistakes. It was chock full of them. And the reason is because these are very complicated questions. We had an event here on Friday before the TPRC where we had several engineers, and I generally trust engineers before I would trust some gadget columnists. And I don't mean that pejoratively. We need gadget columnists. That's a useful thing because gadgets are so complicated. There's so many of them. I want to read them, and I do read Rob for that. But these kinds of questions are so complicated, and when you sort of write a piece as he did on Sunday, that was just, as I said, many factual errors. Like if you prioritize one set of bits, you by definition deprioritize and slow down others. That's just factually wrong. The engineers will tell you that's factually wrong. I mean, you can manage networks in a way that don't degrade bits, but do advance bits, partly because of latency and where they are and how close together the bits are and all that stuff. So that's more worrisome to me.
And everybody fell asleep while you were giving that part of the talk.
I know they did.
Yeah.
All right, here's my bit non-neutrality.
There we go. Again, I don't want to stick my fingers in the thing, but I do think that Rob's article is a very good example of Adam's point about optimism, pessimism. I mean, his piece is rife with this concept that the world will come to an end if we don't have this, and these horrible things will happen, and it will be a worse world than we live in today if we don't do draconian measures. Well, you just heard Rob talk, and half of you fell asleep during it, but that's exactly why. I mean, Rob got to get out there and say, the world will come to an end. Adam's pessimist. All right, there it is. Done. That's so much easier than discussing bit depth and whether or not the TCP/IP standard allows for certain different differentiation in packet networks. It's just over. So I think it's disappointing that Rob wrote such a fear-mongering article, but I don't think it should be surprising because we talked about what Adam talked about earlier. What bleeds leads, and Rob knows it.
Let me sort of come to Rob's defense, which I don't do often, but and just say that I think we have to acknowledge. I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent here, but my oldest of my degrees is in journalism, and I really love to study the history of journalism. We're seeing the emergence of really an old creature, which is sort of a yellow journalist in cyber drag. I mean, it's really sort of a new age of the activist journalist, and tech journalism is full of these people. Juliana is the exception to the rule, I'm sorry to say. We are seeing the decline, if not the outright death, of objective technology policy reporting. When I read Ars Technica, I know I'm not necessarily going to get an unbiased view, but you know what? It's still a very informative one, and I actually trust them on a lot of their tech policy reporting, even though I know where they're coming from. And in their About Us section, it says, we're going to wear our views on our sleeve. What I think Rob's fault is he hasn't come out and made that explicit, that I'm not just a gadget guy, I'm an evangelist or crusader. I'm here to basically tell you the way you should think about these tech policy products as well as whether or not you should buy them. And I'll insert some policy in there as well. The problem is that's 90% of technology reporting today. And I think that's really troubling.
What is that?
Evangelical activist journalism.
So you took Rob's defense by calling him a yellow journalist in cyber drag.
I think there's a well-respected history of yellow journalism.
Is this the end of objective journalism?
I think we're getting close to that. That's right. I'm a pessimist about this, Will. You got me on that one. When you retired from journalism, I knew it was the death of journalism. How's that? Aaron? What are you going to say? You're the executive journalist. You can't say anything.
Except for Juliana.
I read about the paragraph in Rob's column, so I'm not going to comment on what he had to say.
That's sort of a comment of itself.
Busy on something.
All right, well, I think on that note of techno-pessimism, no, actually, I think I actually will leave this on a note of optimism because I'm a conventional optimist. I do think at the end of the day, if you just wait long enough, people do see reason, people do compromise, and compromise is actually a good thing. It's not a bad thing. I remember alienating another journalist here. I'll alienate here. Arrington's piece in TechCrunch, where he wrote a piece a few months ago arguing it was something like, you know, it's trashing the Obama administration and trashing Washington, and why, you know, it was time for Silicon Valley didn't need Washington, and he had, you know, there's some wonderful lines in there like, why did Obama appoint a chief enforcer for IPR, intellectual property rights? And why did he do that? It's like, because Congress created the position that mandated it in OMB. You know, you at least ought to understand something about Washington before you write about it. So, and end of the day, Arrington was like, well, you know, you don't need Washington, and compromise is a terrible thing. We should never have compromise because we know what the truth is. And, you know, to me, that's just such a, you know, kind of really self-destructive view. Washington has always been about compromise, and oftentimes in the best sense of the term, because people have very divergent views on this. So, in the closing it on the optimistic side, I will say I do think that there's a lot of smart people in Washington. There's a lot of people who do bring these issues to bear, to light on all sides of this. All 9 groups can, I think, bring important aspects of this debate to policymakers' attention, and I think oftentimes we do get it right. It's an unbelievably messy process. You don't want to see how the sausage is actually made, but oftentimes it's not bad sausage, and I think you know, we're hopeful that you know, we're going to be making good sausage here in the next few years, and we'll have a, you know, we all just won't get overweight by eating too much of it. So, anyway,
Are you
with
Cyber Jimmy Dean?
Breakfast links.
Exactly. What, pancakes and the sausage.
That's right. All in one.
All of them. So with that, thank you for your attention, and please join me in welcoming, thanking 3 great panelists.